morning, everyone. My name is Soha Amber, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all to NEIU's International Business Conference for 2025. I'm the Vice President of the College of Business and Technology Student Advisory Council. Today, we are honored to invite thought leaders, innovators, and change makers to this annual conference to engage in thought-provoking discussions and exploring and navigating the supply chain industry with a focus on Asian perspectives. We encourage our students to seize this opportunity to network, exchange ideas, and expand their knowledge beyond the classroom. I would like to take a moment to thank our speakers, particularly our keynote speaker for today, Ms. Rosemary Coates, for graciously accepting our invitation to present today at IBC 2025. Some thanks are in order. I want to appreciate and acknowledge the people who have made today successful, who have made today happen. Starting off with our dean, who's not here today, Dr. Michael Bedell, and our faculty advisor, Dr. Tang Ku, Vladimir Fernandez, our staff advisor, the staff at the CBT Dean's Office, Jocelyn Rubeck. Can you please give a round of applause for her? President of the CBT Student Advisory Council, my team members, Jose Colon and Suzanne Polikoski in the CBT Student Advisory Council, and obviously all of our student leaders and volunteers today, in particular, Shalom, Rakesh, Siddhi, Venika, Khushi, Lafe, Mayur, Prajwal, Mary Cruz, and Divi. Once again, welcome to IBC 2025. We have an exciting day planned ahead. I would like to invite Dr. Chume Jane Sher, Associate Dean of the College of Business and Technology, to share opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone. As you might have noticed, typically the dean will make the open remarks, but today he graciously let me to have the honor to do that. Someone will say, this is a great sign of trust. Others will say, maybe that's a test. No matter what, I'll try my best to make him not regret it. Okay, welcome to the International Business Conference hosted by the College of Business and Technology at Northeastern. And this conference, its mission is simple but powerful: to equip our students with knowledge and experience that make you successful in global business. And the legacy of this conference dates back in 2002, when one of our students, Lucas Dabrowski, started the vision to create a platform for connecting students and sharing ideas about global business. And this conference has continued to thrive with the great work of our faculty, students, and staff. With that being said, I would like to take this opportunity to give a huge shout out to our faculty advisor for this conference, Dr. Tang Chu, and our student development director, Mr. Vlad Flanders, and our student leader, Jocelyn Rubeck, along with all our student leaders in College Student Advisory Council. Thank you so much. It's your hard work makes this event possible. Again, if we look at the PowerPoint slide, it shows the conference theme, right? Changing global or Asian, especially Asian supply chain. This is a timely and critical aspect of global business. We are going to have an extensive and exciting program. Topics include, well, let me make sure I get everything right, reshoring strategies. Topics such as evolving trading policies, and topics like AI and supply chain. We are also going to cover how to become a super communicator. And also, we have great alumni join us to discuss all those topics. So it's exciting and it might be exhausting. Don't worry, we're going to have lots of coffee breaks. With that being said, it's my honor to introduce our interim provost and vice president of academic affairs, Dr. Shane Cover.
Good morning. As she said, my name is Shane Kofer. I'm interim provost and vice president for academic affairs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Northeastern and to the 23rd Annual International Business Conference. So I too would like to take a moment to thank and recognize our College of Business and Technology for hosting this event, as well as the planning committee, including students and faculty, for organizing this great conference. Let's give them a hand. Also, I'd like to thank in advance the industry leaders and guest speakers who are here to share their expertise with us today. Let's give them a hand. So, as you know, the theme of the conference is navigating the Asian supply chain, opportunities and challenges. This is such an important and timely topic as we work to understand global business, particularly the role of Asian markets in today's economy. This topic also aligns nicely with the NEIU's commitment to fostering global perspectives in business education. So today I'd like to encourage all of our students to take full advantage of the networking opportunities that you have at this conference. There are many professional and industry leaders here among us, so don't be shy. The value of learning from experts who bring real-world experience cannot be underestimated. The insights shared today will help students and faculty better understand international business dynamics in a shifting environment. So we have an exciting agenda for you today, so please actively participate, ask many questions, and make the most of the opportunities that the conference provides. I hope you enjoy your day and welcome to Northeastern Illinois University. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Victor Guadarrama, and I am the treasurer of the Association of Latino Professionals for America, also known as ALFA. Thank you all for being here. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Bart Edes. Bart is an esteemed analyst, advisor, and speaker on trends that are reshaping Asia and the world. With over 3 decades of experience in international development, governance, and the economic and social transformation of Asia, he brings invaluable insights to our discussion today. Today, Bart will be presenting on how Trump's tariffs will affect trade with Asia. His expertise in international trade and development policy will provide us with a critical understanding of the evolving trade landscape. Please join me in welcoming Bart Edes to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Victor. That's great. Appreciate the generous introduction. And thank you to Northeastern Illinois University for the invitation for me to come south of the border from Montreal, where I'm based. A shout out to Jocelyn and to Vlad and everyone else associated with making this event possible. And to my fellow Bart over here, who just introduced himself. Not too many of us around the world, so we got to stick together. So as has been mentioned in the intro, I'm here to talk a little bit about the impact of President Trump's tariffs on Asia. And let me just make sure that I'm going in the right direction. I am. And as I mentioned, I'm visiting from Montreal. Who here has been to Montreal? Okay, a few. The rest of you need to go at some point. Behind me, you'll see a graph that indicates U.S. imports over a number of years, and it highlights the 5 countries that. Is that better? Oh, for the recording purposes? Okay. Is that better? All right. Sorry about that. So these are the 5 countries that are the leading providers of exports to the United States, or from the U.S. perspective, imports into the United States. And you'll see China, Mexico, and Canada there. And I'm going to talk a lot about those 3 countries in the ensuing slides in the next half hour or so. Those 3 countries account for about 45% of trade, both imports and exports to the United States. So they're very important trading partners, and they play different roles in the trade relationship with the U.S. So I assume that everybody has at least gotten wind of the fact that the U.S. president is keen on tariffs. Does that kind of ring a bell? You've noticed it in the press. I don't know, do people even talk about it? They talk about it in school or in the corridor, or does anybody really care? It's kind of an issue. Okay, I can tell you where I'm from. This is a whole different subject, but just to interject, it is a massive issue in Canada. which sends 75% of its exports to the United States. That's a subject for another day, but that gives you an idea of the interest and concern when, well, we'll get to that in a bit. So why does President Trump love tariffs? And he's more or less said just that. Tariffs are for everything. They are for promoting U.S. manufacturing. They are for potentially raising large sums of money that can be used for priorities of this administration, which include tax cuts, as an example. He's even floated the idea of replacing income taxes with tariffs. Other reasons include trying to negotiate better deals bilaterally and multilaterally with other countries, and not always on trade issues. Okay? There are other issues that the administration has expressed interest about, and the president is using it as a tool to get what he wants for a country that has extraordinary influence on the world, given the size of the massive US market. Some of the problems with relying on tariffs and the various, let's say, objectives that the president has in mind. One is if you're trying to raise money, okay, so that's one objective. We're going to raise money by charging countries for access to the US market. What happens if those companies in those other countries say, okay, we agree to meet one of your other objectives and set up manufacturing here in the United States? Well, if they come to the United States, then they're no longer exporting from whatever country it happens to be. And then you can't be taxing, you can't be putting tariffs on those imports because those imports are now being produced locally. So you're not raising as much money as you anticipated. And if you're using tariffs to try to change behavior, whether it has to do with narcotics or foreign policy or migration issues, once the other country has agreed to go along with what you want, then the assumption is that, okay, you're going to remove this tariff threat. So then again, you aren't applying tariffs to imports. So there are some internal inconsistencies with the whole approach to using tariffs. There's this other one, the last bullet there, and that relates to inflation. So the general prevailing economic view is tariffs as a tax on imports into the country will raise prices. And I have a feeling that you all live in Illinois. Is that? Yes. Well, you may well see this in the next 1 to 6 months, how prices begin to creep up, because if tariffs are indeed applied to other countries, particularly countries that send a lot of goods to the United States, you're going to see prices rise. And so that increases inflation, which is one of the campaign issues that helped elect President Trump for the second time. I'm going to step over here so I can read along with you. This is dizzying to try to keep track. Can you see over my head? This is dizzying trying to keep track of this. And poor Jocelyn, she asked me, can you, 2 weeks ago, can you give me your presentation? I said, I can't. Not only because I'm a bit of a procrastinator and had a couple of other things going, but this is like real time. And just like in the earlier sessions, I was tracking the discussions which are ongoing between the Trump administration and Canada about tariffs that are going to be implemented very soon, like midnight. So, okay. These 2 slides go through the timeline of a whole series of announcements regarding tariffs, which I think it's not the tip of the iceberg, it's more than that. But I think this is a story that will continue for much of this administration. So first of all, on February 1, you may remember this, the president announced he was going to apply tariffs of 25% on imports from Mexico and Canada, 2 of the biggest exporters to the US. And these were scheduled to take effect February 4th. And Canada and the US said, okay, you want us to do something about fentanyl and something to do about securing the borders. Here's what we've done. And the White House said, okay, fine, we'll postpone those tariffs for a month. That month comes up tomorrow. Okay. And then during the campaign, President Trump mentioned he was going to, before he became president again, he said he was going to apply 60% tariffs on China. When he actually became president, he said 20%. And then he said, oh, okay, 10%. And he actually announced those on the 1st, same day as he announced the tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And on the 4th of February, those went into effect. One nuance about the 25% tariffs targeting Canada, which again have been postponed for the time being. It was lowered to 10% for energy. The United States imports a lot of oil, uranium, gas, and electricity from Canada, like a lot. And so I guess the White House figured, well, maybe we don't want to raise prices so much on energy coming into the United States. So there was that minor detail. There won't be a test on this because it is mind-boggling complex, and this is just the beginning. So then on February 10th, the president announced 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum, which will affect Canada, among others. And on the 13th of February, the president announced something concerning reciprocal tariffs. Now, this is getting into new territory. So oftentimes when there's negotiations around tariffs, countries get together and they look at each other's tariffs, and we want you to lower your tariffs on that product, and we'll lower our tariffs on this product. This takes the discussion into other aspects of economic activity and rulemaking and the power of government that goes well beyond tariffs. So that's this slide, okay? So reciprocal trade policy. A memo was issued by the White House on February 13th, explaining that the U.S. was now going to look not only at tariffs, but what do other countries do with their taxes and with their currency? And if we feel that you're being discriminatory in any way toward our products and American business in your country, we may slap on tariffs. So he's taking the concept of trade negotiations beyond just tariffs to potentially dealing with, again, currencies and the value-added tax, which is common in many other countries, including the one I live in and in Europe. So we're going to see what comes of this, but this has the potential to be very unsettling to the trade world because it's hard to put a finger on. And so although at the bottom you'll see that there's a reference to 180 days for the Office of Management and Budget to do some analysis. And actually the president has said by April 2nd, that's his latest date, he's going to start applying these tariffs on countries that in his view are not being fair with the US. This is the last slide on the sequencing, the timeline, if you will. So now we're dealing with autos, semiconductors, and pharmaceuticals. More tariffs. These are not specific to a country, but across the board, tariffs in these areas that could come as soon as April 2nd. An executive order came out last week instructing the Commerce Department to investigate copper imports. And then sweeping tariffs were announced for the EU. And then another 10% on China. He went back to 20% to China. And then on the 28th, late last week, now there's an investigation going on about lumber. So it seems like the White House, you wonder how they have time to deal with all the other things that they're involved with, because it seems they're spending quite a lot of time determining what the new announcement is going to be on slapping tariffs on individual countries or on particular imports. I can't stress the significance of this in terms of a historical development, okay? If the current administration raises the tariffs as has been threatened, and that can vary because there's negotiations going on, and as of now, since President Trump reassumed office, the only tariffs that have been slapped on were on China on the 4th of February, 10% on existing tariffs that were there before, okay? But all these others that have been announced for dates sometime in March or April, if those all kick in, then we're talking about an increase in the average tariff from 2.5% to almost 14%. And we haven't seen that since 1939, which was about the time the Great Depression ended. We don't know if this will actually happen, but I'm going to assume some of this will, because this is a president who likes to be taken at his word. So what's the legal groundwork for this? Because how can he do this when other presidents, Republican or Democrat, why haven't they done this before when they're annoyed with the trading behavior of other countries? Well, he's using something called the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. Okay, so he claimed a huge emergency. This is used in the context of the Canada, Mexico, you got to deal with the border and fentanyl and people coming in undocumented and blah, blah, blah. We're going to use IEPA. And so that's, okay, he's applying that, but at the same time, completely ignoring the fact that there is a regime regulating trade between Mexico, Canada, and the US called the USMCA, it used to be called NAFTA. And that was a renegotiated agreement that the president signed in his first term. And then the other popular part of US law being drawn upon is the so-called Section 232. So similarly concerns national security and such. This was used in the first Trump administration to slap tariffs on steel and aluminum on Canada's exports and exports of some other allies. In some cases, he's just threatened tariffs like against the EU without citing any legal grounds. He's just going to do it because he can. Who's going to stop him? So China, again, as thus far, get back to me at 12:05 a.m., thus far, the only country to be hit with tariffs, actually, how did they respond? Not well. They weren't happy with this. So they responded, but in kind of a calculated fashion. They didn't want to up the ante or, to exacerbate what is an increasingly difficult trade relationship with the US, but they did apply some tariffs to selected products coming from the US. Not listed on the slide there, they also have started an anti-monopoly investigation against Google. They have placed a couple of big US corporations on basically an unfriendly entities list, which could subject them to fines or tariffs at a later date. And they've imposed export controls on rare earths. These are certain elements that are critical for a lot of high-tech products, including smartphones, including windmills, including autonomous electric vehicles, military applications. So China responded, but didn't go as far as they could because they do not want to escalate this, but they do want to show that they can't be pushed around, which is similar to what some other countries are going to be doing soon. Other measures that China may adopt, let's see, because they, like Canada and Mexico, are facing additional tariffs in a few hours. They may try to stimulate the economy because if their exports to the US decline, that may slow economic growth, so they may want to keep the economy stimulated. They might allow their currency to depreciate to boost their exports. They try to promote domestic consumption as well and focus on other parts of the world. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. So talking for a moment about the most populous country in the world, which is in Asia, India. So India hasn't been threatened specifically with tariffs, okay? It's caught up in the same kind of general tariffs that have been threatened, for example, on steel and aluminum and lumber and copper. But it has a problem from the perspective of President Trump. So one thing I didn't mention, the reasons, it was on the slide earlier, why is President Trump using tariffs? One of them is to get at what he drives him crazy, is what he sees a US deficit in trade. That is to say, the US imports more from a country than it exports to that country. And the president sees that as unfair. Most economists would say that doesn't tell you anything. It means that you're importing goods because you want them, not necessarily that the other country is being unfair. They might be unfair, but you haven't investigated that. You just happen to be wanting more from that country than they want from you. In any case, the short story here is India has, it's not quite 50 billion, it's about a $45 billion surplus. US is buying more from India than the other way around, okay? So that puts India in the spotlight for a president who does not like a US trade deficit, okay? So fortunately for India, Prime Minister Modi, its leader, has a good relationship with Trump and vice versa. They get along, but keep in mind, President Trump doesn't really matter which countries he gets along with when it comes to tariffs because he loves tariffs. And so India's again in the spotlight among other countries, the main issue being the surplus, but also they have another problem. They have non-tariff barriers and relatively high tariff rates. So Prime Minister Modi said, look, we'll bring in more Harley Davidsons. We'll buy more oil. We'll buy some gas. We'll buy some defense equipment. He's saying this now so he won't be singled out. His country won't be singled out. And the other thing that matters to the president is, are there people here who do not have the legal, here in the United States, who do not have the legal right to be here? And I'm going to send them all home. There are a number of Indian citizens here who do not have the legal right to be here. And Modi said, oh, you can send them back, I'll take them. So that has made the president happy for the time being. What's the impact on the US economy? Well, most economists would say tariffs are bad, they raise prices, they distort markets, et cetera, et cetera. There will be trade diversion. So trading, and that's a large part of the presentation that's coming, is how might trade flows be affected. Trade circumvention, that is where, for example, China is exporting directly to the US. And if they face some big tariffs, they may, with their tremendous resources, go invest in another country. Think Mexico. They go invest in Mexico and export from Mexico, right? That's trade circumvention. Consumer prices may rise as well. I want to go back for 1 second, because if it seems like I'm being completely disparaging, I'm not trying to be completely disparaging. Here we go, the rationale. Attraction. I'm just trying to call the situation out as it is. On that first point, at about an hour ago, the president held a press conference to announce that the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, which is the largest semiconductor manufacturer in the world, and has previously made big investments in the US, was announcing with President Trump $100 billion of investment over the next 4 years. 100 billion. So President Trump can point to that and say, look, Taiwan hasn't been specifically threatened, but their foreign, economy that's exporting here, they go out in front and say, we're investing. Our biggest company is investing in the United States. Suddenly, Taiwan is in a better negotiating position on resisting tariffs. The other thing the president can point to, this story just broke, is that Honda, so a Japanese company, and you're going to see Japan mentioned on the screen in a bit. Honda was going to invest in Mexico to build Honda hybrid Civics, okay? And the announcement is going to come out imminently that, no, we've changed our mind. We're going to go to a right-to-work state in the US, right next door in Indiana, and starting in mid-2028, we'll be producing 200,000 vehicles a year in the United States. So how does that look for Honda as an individual company and for the country of Japan when it comes to negotiation time? So that first bullet, using the power of tariffs in, say, unconventional or aggressive or dubiously legal ways, it seems to be working for the moment, with the risks I've highlighted about rising prices and the like. Okay. Beyond the legal grounds and China's response and what's China doing next, and then the other big super power of Asia, India, impacts on the US. Okay. So the Federal Reserve is responsible for monetary policy in the US and bank supervision and circulation of money and that sort of thing. And they have 12 regional banks around the country, including in Atlanta. So the one in Atlanta is responsible for bank supervision and other activities in the southeast of the United States. And so they have a model that models the US economy. So it's not the officials who sit on the board who are saying, okay, this is our forecast. It's like, they put in the algorithm and this is what comes out. So their forecast for the first quarter, we're into the last month of the first quarter. A month ago was predicting that the US economic growth would be 4%, not just in that region of the US, but the US, 4%. That was about a month ago. About a week ago, give or take a few days, 2.3%, positive, US growing, booming. Its latest, this model of the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank just came out, and they're now forecasting negative growth of 1.5%. Now, I don't know exactly how much tariff calculations have gone into that, but that's concerning, and I'm surprised it hasn't gotten more attention, but it will. That suddenly the US could, on a dime, be going from net positive booming growth to negative growth, and tariffs being a big part of this administration's economic policy have to figure into that. Okay, a couple of slides on what countries in Asia are at risk. So We know what Donald Trump wants. I've explained why he likes tariffs and what bothers him, including trade deficits and countries perceived to be treating the US unfairly. Asia has 7 countries that are running a trade surplus with the US. Donald Trump doesn't like that. Then in last year, this was before he assumed office, US government, this is just part of the operation of the bureaucracy. There's a report put out by one of the Department of State or somebody else, countries that may be manipulating their currency to their advantage, maybe to boost exports. So there's a few Asian economies there. China's already been hit by tariffs. And before they were hit by tariffs under this administration, they were hit by tariffs under Biden and Trump #1. Okay. They've got their own massive domestic challenges, and now more tariffs are coming. I had mentioned in the case of India that they have non-tariff measures and high tariffs and a surplus. Indonesia and Malaysia. Okay, now Indonesia and Malaysia are exporting inputs into Chinese products. It goes both ways, but they've set up, a trading relationship with China where they're actually sending some goods to China that go into certain products of China that China exports. If those, say, higher and more final products from China are facing more resistance to get into the large US market, they may be exporting fewer of those goods. And Indonesia and Malaysia will find less business through this channel. Japan has a large trade surplus. But their big auto company just announced they're going to produce 200,000 cars and create probably thousands of jobs right next door in Indiana. South Korea also has a surplus in trade, and it is very exposed on steel and aluminum. I don't want to go through every single line, but you can read it for yourself. These are reasons why these countries should be concerned, and they are concerned, and why many of them have started back channel, front channel, every kind of channel communications with the administration to try to reduce the chances that they will be a target for tariffs. Okay. Something else you would want to be worried about if you produce high-tech products, this is the kind of manufacturing President Trump wants. He wants not only manufacturing of, say, automobiles, but high-tech, like this Taiwanese investment, right? And so other countries that are producing high-tech products that could rival the US, if the US builds up the sector even more, they might want to be concerned. And I mentioned circumvention. So China's been investing a lot in Thailand and Vietnam. Not just those 2 countries, but they kind of stand out in Southeast Asia for manufacturing with Chinese investment. And they've also been investing a lot in Mexico. Was anybody aware of that? That China's got massive investment, not only in Mexico, but in South America? It's a really, really big deal. And one of the reasons, especially in the case of Mexico, which has a free trade agreement with the US and Canada, is they come set up shop, they produce locally, and they can export their products duty-free into the United States through the free trade agreement. The only problem is President Trump is now beginning to ignore that free trade agreement, which, by the way, comes up for renegotiation no later than next year. Okay, let me explain this. So these are countries with big trade imbalances with the US. You do not want to be on this side. You really don't want to be on this side, because then that's like waving a red flag in front of a bull. It's US trade, it's not a surplus, deficit with different countries as a percentage of US gross domestic product. In a nutshell, okay, the lower the bar, the higher that country's surplus is with the US, making it a target. So in case you have any challenges with the 2-letter abbreviations starting from the right, that would be China, Vietnam, Japan, Korea, South Korea, Taiwan, India, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, and Singapore. This is a really good time to be Singapore or the Philippines. So Singapore is not a low-cost producer. They don't have massive factories exporting to the US. Philippines never really built up its manufacturing base. And there are security reasons why the US might be giving the Philippines a break, but they're in a better place than the countries over here. Okay. Now this is focused on aluminum and steel. Okay. In this case, it's steel and aluminum exports to the US as a percentage of that country's GDP. The shorthand, all you need to know is if you're on the left side, you're exposed to tariffs on aluminum and steel from the US. Vietnam has multiple reasons to be very nervous. They've done very, very well, as I'll explain a bit more in the next few slides, but you would have the officials there are sleepless, not sleepless in Seattle, but sleepless in Saigon, I think is what's going on here. So what are businesses doing, or what should businesses be doing? Behind me are some clues. So when I say businesses, those are businesses that are tied up in global supply chains, that have a stake in trade from one side or the other. They will want to look at their cost structures. They will want to look at what are these emerging tariffs. They will be monitoring the news today, many of them. Is he or isn't he going to slap tariffs on Canada and Mexico at midnight? Oh, and add to the tariffs already assigned to China. You want to diversify your inputs. You want to diversify your supply chains. In many cases, there may be a bit of reshoring. We heard about reshoring first thing this morning for those of you who are here. There's also nearshoring. So nearshoring is you set up your plants or your supply chains closer to home. So in Mexico, for example, or Canada, or Caribbean, or Chile, instead of across the water in say Central and Eastern Europe or Asia. And you use technology. We just had a whole presentation on AI. There's all kinds of ways of using AI algorithms to analyze different tariff structures. And can you tweak a product, to move it into a different trade category, which might lower the tariff rate. So there's a number of things companies can do to lower their risks and be prepared for change. Okay, we have seen in recent years, and it's not just under President Trump, we've seen a reordering of trade relationships and supply chains. So the US has continued to shift trade away from China. It is now kind of a priority, and not just of this administration, they talk about decoupling. There's not going to be complete decoupling, but now they're talking about de-risking. So trying to limit China's access to certain high-end, say, technologically sensitive goods and emerging sectors. So there are investment and trade restrictions that go well beyond tariffs. And China has lost shares of US imports across almost all sectors. ASEAN economies, does anybody know what ASEAN stands for? Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. So basically it's Southeast Asia, now comprising of 10, soon 11 countries. And many of the Asian countries I've mentioned, not India, not China, not Japan, but many of the rest are in ASEAN, which is not an economic union, but among other things, they coordinate increasingly on political and economic issues and are trying to loosen trade and strengthen ties among them. So ASEAN economies are becoming increasingly integrated as intermediaries between China and US, two of the world's big players in terms of large economies. So what that means, again, coming back to China, investing in Vietnam or Thailand and exporting to the US. You'll see in the second to last bullet what Vietnam is doing. So if you read the fine print there, they've been getting a lot of Chinese investment, okay, and that's been booming, and also some Chinese exports of certain goods that are repackaged. They add something to them, and then they send them to the US as a Vietnamese product that up to now may not have faced the same restrictions as Chinese products. Trade circumvention, okay? Malaysia and Indonesia have been doing, Malaysia and Thailand have been doing a bit of this. Continuing with the trade and supply chains, I mentioned de-risking and US reducing its dependence on China. One thing that China has seen is that they have to move beyond what made its great success in terms of economic growth and sharply reducing poverty. Was it served as the world's factory floor, as the manufacturing center of the world, and they're moving not completely away from that, but they're trying to balance how their economy is supported, and they're looking more at promoting domestic consumption, so less reliance on exports, which puts them at great risk, not just from the US, but they're trying to send EVs to Europe and Europe has something to say about that as they're trying to support their own car industries. And they see that the U.S. isn't going to, whatever the administration, U.S. is not going to become friendlier to China in important manufacturing areas and in high-tech areas. Another aspect of Southeast Asia is not only are they exporting, they're becoming a really big manufacturing hub. Some countries that have built up a stronger manufacturing base have really capitalized on this. And you can see in the last 2-3 bullets examples of U.S. companies going in and investing in Southeast Asia, including in Penang, Malaysia. Now, India is an interesting case. So India has managed to keep good relations with everybody. And they're so big and important geopolitically, as well as their growing economy, that it's difficult for other countries to mess with India, including big countries like the US and China and Russia. So everybody wants to do business with India, even if they have problems with India, like high tariffs, or they don't like their position on a particular geopolitical issue. India has somehow been able to kind of finagle a neutral stance. What will be interesting to see is how much they can escape or negotiate away tariffs that may be coming their way from Washington. This slide talks about, and this is from Rhodium, which is a consultancy firm that studies trade and investment issues, particularly involving China, and looking at 4 big sectors where China over the last decade has had enormous influence on the world economy in terms of production and exporting, although there are some nuances and there's some developments. So if you jump to the bottom bullet, you'll see that China used to be an importer of cars, and now it's a manufacturer. And it's not just cheap cars. They're putting out high-end cars, and they're putting out very inexpensive EVs. I was just in the Philippines. So I didn't mention at the outset, I spent 17 years living in Asia. I lived in Southeast Asia and traveled all around for my work. This year, by July, I will have gone to East or Southeast Asia 4 times for my consultancy work. So I remain very connected to the region and keep an eye on what's happening. And so I've seen a lot of this transpire in the coming and going and the living there for the last 10 years. Solar, China's become, I think many of you know, China's the big manufacturer of solar panels. And I just mentioned about automotives. And the point of that story about me spending time in Asia is in the Philippines, they are importing EVs from China, left, right, and center. So it's harder to do in the US or Europe, but other countries in Asia, even if they're friendly to the US, they're not resisting cheap quality cars that are also contributing to greening and sustainable aims of those countries. Consumer electronics, of course, that's an area China has been a dominant exporter for a while. Now, apparel, things are changing. We heard this morning from Rosemary about how China's not as cost competitive in many areas as it used to be. So manufacturing of apparel is shifting away from China to lower cost areas, including, as an example, Vietnam, including Bangladesh. And one part of the world that really has gone unmentioned today, well, because we're focused on Asian supply chains, but because supply chains are global, it's worth mentioning that Africa is part of the equation. And one of the areas I spend a lot of time advising companies and organizations on is on strategic foresight, basically using ideas about the future to better understand and anticipate change. And if we're looking at changes not just in the next few hours or a few months or years, if we look 10 or 20 years out, Africa is going to be an increasingly important growing player. There was a mention of, for example, population and the growth of population in Africa. Not just population, it's economic weight and the growth of the middle classes. So I cite this in reference to apparel because another country that's coming up in terms of apparel manufacturing, particularly for Europe, given proximity, is Ethiopia. Opportunities for Southeast Asia. So I mentioned some of the opportunities. Vietnam has been a vacuum of investment. They're getting tons of investment, but not only from China. They get it from Taiwan, they get it from Japan, they get it from Korea, they get it from the US, but particularly from mainland China. And other countries nearby also have been doing a good job of attracting Chinese investment. And you'll see the figure there, $24 billion in investment in 2023 from China to Southeast Asia. Regional trade is growing too, and I'll talk about regional integration in Asia. EV production. You have EV production centers in Southeast Asia. Here's another space that may be affected by the US administration not being nearly as keen on EVs as the former administration. And will that have an impact on global demand and production? Maybe that'll hit Southeast Asia in its emerging EV manufacturing capacity. One of the challenges for Vietnam and other countries in attracting more investment is they only have so much infrastructure. Vietnam has attracted so much investment, has so many new factories, billions and billions of dollars of manufacturing capacity. At some point, you hit the limits of their skilled labor force, and literally the roads are clogged, the ports are clogged. They don't have the capacity to take more investment. And many companies, multinational enterprises, would be interested in setting up shop in Vietnam, but prices are rising for land, for factories, for skilled labor, and there's a massive deficit in infrastructure financing. So it's not easy to get completely out of China. If you've seen the reference to China plus one, I think this was mentioned in Rosemary's talk. China plus one is a strategy where you no longer rely only on China for your investments. With your new investment, for example, you look at another country, another region of the world to de-risk, to not put all your eggs in the Chinese basket, even if it makes sense superficially from a economic standpoint. ASEAN has become a massive trade partner with China. And just to come back to ASEAN, again, 11 countries in Southeast Asia. It's not like the European Union, it's not an economic union, but increasingly they're establishing trade deals and cooperation and harmonizing rules. They're moving that direction. They may never reach it because there's too many differences in terms of level, standard of living and political systems and culture and past conflicts, et cetera, but they are trying to increase their centrality in the big Asian economic sphere. And if you take ASEAN as an economic bloc, it will soon become the fourth largest in the world, behind China, the US, and the EU. Right now, it sits behind Japan, but it will surpass Japan. And that's largely because of its bigger economies like Indonesia. I had mentioned Vietnam. The Philippines, although not big on manufacturing, is big in services like business process outsourcing. And Singapore is a wealthy country. Brunei, small country, but also wealthy. It's an Asian economic integration. I'll let you check this out behind me. Basically, FTAs are free trade agreements. So ASEAN as a bloc did negotiate free trade agreements with countries over time. And then in 2020, they negotiated the mother of all free trade agreements. So all the ASEAN countries together, they drew in with other countries in the neighborhood in Australasia. So Australia, New Zealand, China, South Korea, Japan, and they created something called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. That flows off the tongue. RCEP, which is easier to say. So it's a massive free trade agreement covering a large share of the world's GDP. And you're seeing that is boosting intra-Asia trade. And there's another trade agreement that's, say, a more demanding one. It requires more in terms of environmental and social sustainability and more specific on rules, and has maybe a more sophisticated trade dispute settlement mechanism. That's called the CPTPP, which is another name that flows off the tongue, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so that is a free trade agreement involving mostly Asian countries, but interestingly includes Canada, Chile, Peru, I'm not sure about Mexico, maybe Mexico, and the UK. So the UK left the EU and is looking for trading partners. So they joined in with a mostly Asian grouping, the CPTPP. And there's an overlap in membership, at least the Asian membership, between the RCEP and the CPTPP. The point there is you have these big free trade agreements that are reinforcing and charging the integration of Asian economies, not cutting themselves off from the rest of the world, but increasingly their trade is with each other, as we saw from that last graph, as ASEAN and China become increasingly linked together. Some conclusions. Trump's, let's call it, unusual or tradition smashing approach to tariffs, use of tariffs. This comes with some risks. I pointed out where he can cite some successes of manufacturing coming to the United States, like big time, billions and billions. And there's probably going to be more of that. But at what cost if he slaps massive tariffs on other countries and those countries turn around and slap tariffs on the US, you can get a negative spiral as we have seen in past history in the world. Asian economies and businesses are going to have to be prepared to face massive tariffs. And I highlighted some of the countries, and there's several of them that are at risk because of their current policies or surpluses with the US. The future of global trade depends in part, so to say in large part, on how the US and China manage their differences. They are selectively decoupling with national security considerations in the background. Countries who are affected by US trade tariffs are going to react by slapping on tariffs of their own or desperately trying to negotiate some kind of a compromise on the part of the US government. And Trump's policies could, I'm not saying definitely, but could, just based on modern understanding of economics and plenty of historical examples, could result in increased inflation, could lower manufacturing output, notwithstanding the investments that are coming in. There could be negative impacts caused by the tariffs that would also have an impact on jobs. In terms of an economic turndown, I just pointed out the slide from the Federal Reserve in Atlanta, forecasting that imminently this economy is going to take a dive. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but this is a reputable, nonpartisan part of the US state that is highlighting, basically raising a red flag with their model that tariffs and other administration policies could lead to some trouble. So that's all I've got for you today. I really appreciate you, especially just after lunch. It's hard to keep your eyes open. I hope you found this at least a little interesting and timely, given where we're at. If you have follow-on questions and you're hesitant to raise them here or you think of them later, feel free to reach out to me. You can also follow me on various social media. So thanks so much. I will take the odd question, even if it's not an odd question. I would only ask one thing. If you say who you are, give me a name, because you know mine, and where you are. Are you faculty? Are you student? Are you just passing by for a free meal? And whatever it happens to be, let me know. Stunned silence after lunch. No, we've got a speaker. Yay.
I am Daisy. I'm a student. Do you see Trump getting rid of the tariffs in the next 3 years, 4 years of his presidential?
No.
Okay. So would you say that his tariffs are working, especially now since Honda decided to come here instead of Mexico?
Okay. Are they working? We're on what, day 40? So I'm going to do the math. Day 40 of the Trump administration 2.0. It's way too early to know whether they're working. I mean, he will, of course, tout that example. And there are other examples, not only of foreign investment, but American companies that have made big announcements that they're remaining committed to the US market and making multi-billion-dollar investments. So, but that's information, that's an anecdote, and it could be significant, but there are many other things to look at. And we are already seeing signs of rising inflation, and it's not just eggs. So the jury is out. And then there are other aspects of the administration's policies that could also have a big impact on the economy, not to mention society and stability and everything else. So too early to tell, but almost every mainstream economist, trade economist will tell you, this is crazy what he's doing, okay? Is it crazy? He's flexing muscles and using power in a way it has not been used before. And because it's the US and not some small country, it can have an impact and is causing others to react. He's setting the agenda. He is setting the agenda and getting other countries to do what he wants. And what he wants beyond this strange obsession with surpluses and deficits and trade, he wants manufacturing here. Make America great and all that. We'll see. I'll come back next year and tell you. Waiting for the invitation. Jocelyn.
Hello,
Yes.
I'm Rinko. I'm a student. How have the tariffs affected consumer prices and product availability in both US and Asia?
How has the what affected that?
The tariffs affected the consumer.
They haven't yet, because you've had 10% tariffs added on top of existing restrictions and tariffs on China. And that was like in the last 3 weeks. And in China threw on, tariffs in response in certain specific areas. Again, I answer, and I'm sorry, it seems like a cop-out, but it's true. It's still early days. And it's a fast moving sort of situation. But you can be sure that the mainstream press will be reporting on what the think tanks and the banks and the financial analysts and what business leaders are saying. We will know in the coming months which direction this is all going in. One thing I'll be fascinated to see. So look, President Trump has been very consistent in this space about tariffs. He's been very consistent. Tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. He loves tariffs. And we know he needs to raise money to fund, and I'm not making any political statement. This is just what he said, to fund tax breaks, massive tax breaks. But he needs money to do that. He sees tariffs as a way of doing that. And he's even aspired, maybe it's just an offhand comment in this case, of replacing US income taxes with tariffs, which hasn't happened in about 200 years in America. Well, that's slight exaggeration, but it's just, it's not something a modern market economy even thinks about, except today, now. So let's see where he goes with this. Does he keep the tariffs because tariffs are something that he sees as part of America's future? Forcing manufacturing to come here. You want to access this market, you have to set up shop here, and we're putting tariffs on you to make sure that you are incentivized to come here, because your exports from your country will face tariffs. But if you set up in Indiana or Illinois or somewhere else in the country, then you're good. You face no tariffs. Hello again. Is this the sleepy side of the aisle?
No, I was just,
I'm coming to you. Oh, he's got a mic. What can I tell you?
I got the mic.
Bart.
Yes, Bart. This is more of a question for the UK. You said they joined the Asian side of the commerce instead of why wouldn't they join like the European side?
Okay, so to be specific, there's so I mentioned that earlier that there's a free trade agreement in North America where there has been for a long time, now called the USMCA, US, Mexico, Canada, USMCA. So for the 3 countries here, the agreement I was talking about there, so it's not an economic union, it just regulates trade basically, but it crosses the Pacific. So it's mostly Asian countries, but it's from the start, it included some on, let's say, this side of the Pacific. So you had, Chile on the coast, Mexico on the coast, Peru on the coast, United States was in it at the beginning, but pulled out and never joined in the end, and Canada's in. So those countries in a mostly Asia-based free trade agreement are trading with each other freely. Well, I mean, with the usual restrictions and nuances and exceptions. But the UK left the EU, which is yet another topic I have strong views on, but they left the EU, so no longer have free trade with the European Union. They need economic partners, having turned their back on a massive, the second largest market or third in the world. They said, no, we don't want to be part of you anymore. So then they're like, darn, we got to trade with somebody. And they see this free trade agreement that already spans continents, and they're reasonable sized economy, small compared to the US, but we're talking 60 million people in an advanced market economy. They're not nothing. And so countries in Asia, for example, they're like Peru and Chile. Sure, I'd like to send my goods, Chilean wine and Peruvian ceviche and whatever else to the UK. So that's why the UK joined, was just access. It's not an end game. It's not committing them only to that set of countries, because there's talk of a US-UK agreement. There's talk of a UK-Canada agreement. Those have yet to be negotiated. And the UK is renegotiating its relationships with the EU to stay out, because they don't want to be subject to the rules of the EU, but they want to have more access to the EU market like they used to enjoy. So it was opportunistic. And it was also in the interest of the countries already in this, what's called CPTPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership for short. Victor,
Hello.
aren't you impressed? I know everybody's name.
Have the tariffs led to a significant trade diversion with other countries looking for alternative markets or suppliers?
Yes. So it seems to contradict what I just told these people, because I'm not talking about the tariffs since Trump has come into power, because there was the threat, longstanding threat of tariffs. President Trump has been talking about tariffs since he was in office at the beginning, whatever, 9 years ago. The Biden administration was not completely adverse to tariffs, although it was not anything like this. So countries, particularly in the case of China, because China is being squeezed, the US is making life difficult for China. And there's reasons why Washington is doing that. And it's not all trade related. A lot of it has to do with security and alliances and et cetera, et cetera. But just you've had movement from China, companies moving from China into Southeast Asia, where the company figured that here in Thailand or in Malaysia, we're not likely to be targeted by the US in the same way that China is being targeted. So it's safer to have some of our manufacturing here as a foreign company, whether it's American or something else. So that movement has been going on for several years as China's come under more pressure. Companies, big manufacturers have thought we need to spread our risk a little bit, keep that base in China, but with new investment, let's put some investment somewhere else, a country that doesn't make America mad and is not the target of tariffs. The problem now for everyone outside the US is everyone, literally every country is a target of tariffs. It's not a case of, are you a friend or not? Well, being a friend can help for sure, but it doesn't necessarily absolve you of tariffs completely. Watch what happens between now and tomorrow with Canada and Mexico, okay? So they will almost certainly add an extra 10% to tariffs to China, the administration. The Commerce Secretary in the last 48 hours said, oh, there will be tariffs on Canada and Mexico on Tuesday, but how much depends on President Trump. So they've threatened 25%, 10% for Canadian energy, but maybe that comes down because Canada's given something to the US, something it wants that may have nothing to do with trade.
This is a two-part question, but do you see the US gaining control back of the Panama Canal? And if so, how would other countries retaliate to that?
Well, this gets into foreign and international affairs. I wasn't briefed on this being a question.
Sorry.
Okay. This is really not a trade question. This is flexing international muscles. Who knows? The US has tremendous leverage, but Panama is a sovereign state. Panama is going to do what it thinks is in its interest, and no one's going to effectively come to its defense. The EU or China are not going to send troops to Panama to defend the canal. That ain't going to happen. Panama doesn't have enough. They have police officers. You know, if the US wants the canal, it can violate all norms of civilized behavior and go steal it. Good. Do they want to do that? Kind of like Russia and the Ukraine? I doubt it, but they will use economic coercion to get a lot of what they want. So I don't think the US, yeah, he announces he wants President Trump says he wants the canal, but he would probably settle for something less, like certain guarantees. So already, as an example, there's a Hong Kong company, keeping in mind Hong Kong is part of China. It is China's, right? Semi-autonomous within China. It's a Hong Kong company that has a contract to run part of the canal. And Panama has started an investigation of, I believe, that contract. You'd have to check the particulars. That only happened after President Trump said, you know, I want to take the Panama Canal back. Similar to Greenland. And I have to cite Greenland because I recently wrote an op-ed in Canada's equivalent of the New York Times, arguing that Greenland shouldn't stay with Denmark, or doesn't want to stay with Denmark, shouldn't join the US, but should voluntarily join an economic union with Canada. But that's off topic. Greenland, though relevant to your question, is Trump says he wants to go take Greenland. That's really, really unlikely, right? But what's really likely is Greenland is going to give all kinds of concessions or rights to American companies to mine minerals and strengthen its defense relationship, security relationship with the United States. There's already a US Air Force base there. Okay, so Trump also saying he wants Greenland. He does have security considerations in mind. And while it's rather unconventional and not really civilized to say, I'm going to go take Greenland, which technically is part of the Kingdom of Denmark, an ally and NATO member, but what he wants is not necessarily ownership of Greenland. I mean, that'd be great, but a much greater effective control or influence. And that's what I think he'll end up negotiating. And the same applies to the Panama Canal. This is conjecture. Look, I didn't come to talk about national security and international affairs, and your view it may be more enlightened than mine on those topics, but that's my take. Hi.
Hi, my name is Jerry. I'm a student here.
Hi.
My question is, with everything that you just described, with all the investments that are coming in, it seems the goal of the administration is for the United States to become more self-sufficient and rely less on partners because of all the resources that we already have.
Bingo.
So two-part question. Part one, is that such a bad thing? Two, going back to what you mentioned about Canada and that 75% of all their exports come here, is that a bad thing that they've made us so heavy, that they rely so heavily on us instead of focusing on their own resources and building up their economy themselves, as Trump is trying to do here?
With regard to the first question, keep in mind, I'm Canadian, I'm not American. You're American, so you probably have greater insights into the political system here. I would just note that of those who bothered to go to the polls in November, a plurality, almost 50%, more than any other candidate, supported Donald Trump, who made that a message under the banner of Make America Great Again, was to bring manufacturing here, to have products made here, to build up the economic base here. Americans aren't resistant to that idea, I would say. They don't seem to be. How it's done and all the other things the administration may be doing, those are other matters. But on that specific question, building up the strength of America, the question is, at what cost? So I pointed out some of the economic risks. There's also, it's a big, complicated world where, as influential as the US is, it's not as influential as it was, relatively speaking, in the 90s after the Soviet Union broke up, and it was only the US. That was the only superpower and tremendous influence. And there's less influence today. And having alliances and partners and sticking with people who have stuck with you, nations that have stuck with you, there's probably some value in that. So, you know, making America strong from a manufacturing standpoint and trying to reclaim some of that lost manufacturing, not necessarily a bad thing, right? Again, depends, the devil's in the detail. It's how you go about it. And are you seeking the most from your alliances, which can prove extremely useful and empowering in many ways. And if you're cutting those willy-nilly, then may come back to bite you, especially if those, you know, those allies become less allied in the future. On the second question, Canada is stupid and lazy for allowing itself to become so incredibly dependent on one actor. And it's easy. Something like, I don't know, I forget the exact percentage. It's over 80% of the Canadian population lives within 100 miles of the United States. I mean, most of you haven't been to Montreal. Who hasn't been to Canada? Okay. And okay, so a minority of you, and the rest of you are now thinking, why haven't I been to Canada? It's a nice country. I hear good things about it. It's not far, but the point is Canada is so close to the US, except for the weird province I live in where French is the language. It's English, and many of the people in Quebec speak English as well. It's just culturally, they're so similar, right? Families are intertwined. Business has been intertwined forever. Allied, you know, every war the US fights, Canada's been there, even when other allies haven't been there. So the 5,000-mile undefended border, you know, you couldn't get any closer. And that explains in part why it's just so easy to ship your products to Buffalo, right? Or to Seattle or to Boston, just, you know, on the other side of the border or further south, than to think about, oh man, I have to learn Spanish and go to, you know, send my stuff to Mexico or Asia. It's so complicated, exotic. In Europe, well, you know, I got to get across the Atlantic. What's that going to cost? And other than the UK, you know, so it's just easy, right? But with that easiness, they're realizing more and more, starting with the first Trump administration, that nothing is guaranteed in this world. So on that topic, because you've opened the door there, you're going to regret this. So you have no idea of the fury in Canada right now. So nobody thinks that Canadians are nice, right? That's kind of the image, except that maybe playing ice hockey. They're a nice country and they're so friendly and they're kind of simple, but they're nice people. They are really mad, and this is being reflected in a level of anti-Americanism I've never seen. This is the country that, they have relatives across the board. They have homes in Florida. They all of them support NFL teams. They're Canadians in Ontario backing the Bears. I mean, it's so close, right? They watch American television. We watch American television. But this is the talk of the president. It's not just the tariffs. It's the 51st state thing. It's the calling the prime minister, the head of government, the governor, disparaging. I mean, just the wanton disrespect for a close ally that's always been there for the US. Canadians are stunned, and they're mad. And if these tariffs go on, it'd be bad, and it's going to be even worse because Canada is going to respond. And Canadians are starting to boycott the US, and US companies are starting to feel it, especially in the tourism business. It's a real thing. It's just unfathomable in my lifetime that Canadians are boycotting the US.
So just following up on that. So one, to your point, they only have themselves to blame because you said that
Yes.
let it happen. So
Yes.
you can be mad in any situation that'll happen in life. If you let it get to that point, it's your own government that allowed that to happen. So the rhetoric, unfortunately, is what it is, but it is their own fault. So, and then one more just quick follow-up.
Let me just pause you there. Okay. I can't disagree with any of that. And there are a lot of Canadians doing self-examination and coming to that conclusion. We've been asleep at the wheel for so long, but not to absolve the very aggressive unilateral behavior of the United States. So it's not all on Canada for the US, citing fentanyl, which is a non-issue, and migration, which is a non-issue. And, if there's a problem with stuff going across the border, it's guns coming into Canada. But anyway, carry on.
Just going back on what you said about everything being equal, right? Having partnerships and being fair. It does seem, and you'd have to do a deep dive into the actual numbers to find out what it is and for how long. But it does seem that our partners have abused. That's why they have these surpluses and we're in the negative with them. Whereas the whole point of it being reciprocal is for everything to be more balanced out, correct? So I guess my question on that is, how long has it led up to this point? And that seems to be the reason why they're approaching it so aggressively.
It is a simplistic and incorrect assumption that because a country has a trade surplus with you, that they're being unfair. There may be unfair element. Actually, there's always unfair elements, including from the US side, which heavily subsidizes agriculture as one example. So there's always elements of unfairness, but in the big picture, President Trump negotiated a free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico in his first term. He was satisfied with that arrangement. And then under all objective analysis, and I'm obviously not objective, but pointing to objective analysis, the reasons he's citing for going after Canada without having any kind of conversation or serious discussion, but just I'm slapping a 25% tariff to get what I want tomorrow. It's not a matter of unfairness in this case. It's just he looks north and he thinks they're a lot like us. They have a lot of natural resources. They should be part of the US. I mean, you imagine how a Canadian reacts to that. Notwithstanding the failings that we agree on the part of the Canadians, how did you get yourself in this boat? Well, one reason they got in this boat was never thought the US would turn its back on Canada this way. If you did want to cite unfairness, and we're getting really down to Canada rabbit hole, we can have a talk after, over coffee or something. There are some unfair aspects of the relationship, but it doesn't take an approach like this, which is not, between closest of allies. It's not really, the nicest way to do this or civil way to do this. There is a fair point about security. Canada has not been spending enough on its own security and has been relying on US defense for its big time protection. There, among some other areas, US has a point, but again, it's like you're taking a bazooka to kill a mosquito, you might think bite you. Anyway, we can go back and forth on that. Most Americans don't have it out for Canada, right? Anyway, it's not going to help either country. This battle is not going to help either country, and it's going to hurt everybody in this room with prices going up if the tariffs go through. But they might negotiate something, which would be the best result. Way too much Canada for an Asia supply chain conference. Thanks for the provocative question.
Anyone Anyone else?
Anyone else?
All right. Oh.
You're hesitant. You're not sure if you want to ask this question. Go on, spit it out. But who are you? Who are you?
My name is Ivy, and I have a question.
What are you studying?
I'm studying accounting.
Accounting?
Yes.
You're going to have a job. As long as you pass your courses and, you know, certification and all that.
Yeah. This is a simple question.
Sure.
If Canada were to become less of an ally to US, what factors might drive that shift?
President Trump calling it the 51st state. President Trump demeaning the prime minister. President Trump slapping 25% tariffs on Canadian exports. That would make Canada less of an ally. But I think this is a phase. I don't think the Canadians are going to be pissed off and they're going to boo the national anthem, and there'll be probably some ugliness that I don't want to see and most people don't want to see in the short term. But I don't. These two countries are stuck next to each other, and they have too much in common and too many longstanding ties that it's like, you know, you get a spat with your best mate or something, right? You don't talk for 3 months. It's like there's just. It's almost inconceivable. And President Trump's going to be president for 4 years, less than 4 years now. And in 2 years, he'll be a little bit of a lame duck because all, you know, aspiring Republicans who want to be next president are going to be starting to speak up and won't necessarily agree with everything he's done. So, and the next president, Republican or Democrat, probably isn't going to have it out for Canada. So they'll be friends again. And still, for the most part, they're friends. But there's going to be a lot of anger and shouting and mutual claims of this and that, and you haven't done this, and well, but you did that, and we'll see a lot of that. One thing that's it's blown my mind is there's a massive grassroots movement in the U.S., sorry, in Canada, to buy Canadian, and some of that spills into I ain't buying American, which is hard to do because American stuff is all around you in Canada, but. I guess if there's a silver lining, it's building self-resilience and building up what they should have done years ago, a failing of Canada, building up stronger economic ties, not to decouple from the US because that won't happen, but to have a more balanced trade relationship by doing more in Asia and in Europe, for example, and Latin America, not to mention Africa for the longer term. And on that note,